Good evening, friends. It's so exciting to be pumped up with the music. If you did anything but watch Jason, you would realize that he's kind of doing a dance there with his wife in the background, but it was great to hear. Thank you, staff band, so much. It's great to be here. It's great to have everyone here. I used to say to the congregation on a Sunday morning when I stood up, I used to say, "You came back." And we're so glad you're back. We're so glad you're a part of this discipleship journey. I'm Les Burrows, and along with my co-host Indira Albert, we are your guides as we move through this series of major themes in our territorial mission statement. Indira.
So thank you, Les. So before we begin, as we gather from across the territory, we acknowledge that since time immemorial, Indigenous people, nation have lived on this land referred as the Total Island. Currently, I'm speaking from a traditional unceded territory of the Kanawaki Mohawk, a place in which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange amongst nations. The Kanawaki Nation is recognized as the custodians of the land and the waters on which I am today. The Tioke, Montreal, historically known as the gathering place for many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other people. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other people within the Montreal community.
Now, as we gather in this way, we're joined and we're pleased to be joined by our territorial leaders. And we want to welcome Commissioners Floyd and Tracy Tidd. Hi, folks. Good to see you. Not that you had a choice, but we're glad you're here. We really are. And we thank you both for your presence and your time.
And if you join us in March, you are aware that the following month we will be putting out a theme from our new territorial vision statement. And we have special guests and leaders that will help us to unpack it.
So our vision statement says this: we are an innovative partner mobilized to share hope wherever there is hardship, building communities that are just and know the love of Jesus. It's important for us to note that the vision statement is to be understood in the context of our mission statement. That is so important. And our values are so important. So you can check those out on salvationarmy.ca and put the pieces together so you fully understand what we're talking about.
And tonight we will consider the importance of sharing hope by interim president of Booth University College, Dr. Donald Burke, who will help us to unpack the concept of sharing hope. We also note that Dr. Burke will be concluding his time as interim president of Booth University, and we want to thank him for his great contribution, not only to Booth University College, but at the Great Salvation Army work.
Now, before we invite Dr. Burke to jump in and share from his heart, we want to do a little, make some highlights and a little housekeeping to make sure our time together goes well and is enjoyable. You will have received, when you logged in, your mic has been muted. You will notice that, but your cameras have been left on. This is so those joining us on Facebook can see all your beautiful smiles and faces, but can only hear the questions and answers that will be asked of our guests and not everyone's dog, children, and mother-in-laws possibly. But whatever is in the background, we want to make sure that's not coming forth. If you would prefer not to be seen on this live stream to Facebook, please turn off your camera by clicking on the camera icon in the bottom left of your screen. Now, for a best viewing experience, set your screen on speaker view during the main session so that whoever is currently speaking will appear full screen on your device.
Avoid typing messages to the whole group during the main session. This can become distracting to other viewers. There will be lots of time to chat when the breakout groups.
Now, if you lose your internet connection or are booted from the meeting by some means, stay calm and join the meeting again when you can. If there's a technical glitch or your speaker freezes, please stay with us as the Together in Vision tech team works to address the problem. In some circumstances, an error slide will appear on your screen while the team is at work.
And so now we will turn over the mic to Dr. Burke. After Dr. Burke's message, we will set up our breakout groups and leaders. But if you are curious about this week's breakout groups, the information about them is in your email from Eventbrite. Dr. Burke, the mic is yours.
Thanks so much, Indira. First of all, it's great to be here. And before this is done, you may be wishing or praying even for a technical glitch. So we'll see how this goes tonight. Give it some thought. I'm going to do something perhaps a little bit different than perhaps even what was expected. So here goes. It was really quite a remarkable scene. In the midst of a persistent political and military crisis, the prophet Jeremiah pranced around Jerusalem with a wooden ox yoke on his shoulders. A short time earlier, the Babylonian armies had swept through the tiny kingdom of Judah, defeating its little army and carrying off some of the leaders of Judah, including the king, into exile in Babylon. Those who were left behind under the leadership of the puppet ruler Zedekiah maintained an outward loyalty to the Babylonian conquerors, but in secret, they longed for an opportunity to throw off the Babylonian yoke and to bring their exiled family and friends back home to Jerusalem. These hopes were being stoked by another prophet by the name of Hananiah. He was proclaiming a word from the Lord that this crisis would soon pass and the exiles would come home. He was proclaiming that there was an easy way to hope, that there was an easy path. God, after all, had promised centuries earlier that Jerusalem would never be conquered by an enemy. The prophet Jeremiah, however, saw that such hopes for a quick return were futile, based on wishful thinking and false theological convictions that God would protect Jerusalem and Judah against all enemies and at all costs. Jeremiah's presence in Jerusalem with a wooden ox yoke on his shoulders was a visual reminder that there was another word from God at work in Judah. Perhaps not a happy word, maybe even not a hopeful word. Well, a confrontation materialized when Hananiah publicly disputed Jeremiah's message. Representing the interests of those who hoped for a quick return from Babylon, Hananiah confronted Jeremiah and smashed the ox yoke from his shoulders. And as he did so, Hananiah announced, "Thus says the Lord, just as I've smashed this ox yoke from your shoulders, so too I will smash the ox yoke or the yoke of the Babylonians and bring home your family and friends within 2 years." To Hananiah and the wishful thinkers who supported him, this was a hope they thought was based upon the promises God had made to David centuries earlier. But Hananiah's so-called hope, from Jeremiah's perspective, was nothing more than deceptive words, a lie. It distorted the traditions of Israel into an unrecognizable absolute guarantee of God's protection. It was a terrible fraud perpetrated against the people of Judah, encouraging them to believe a lie and preventing them from facing reality. A short time later, Jeremiah returned to the public square and announced that while Hananiah may have smashed a wooden yoke, the Lord had now fashioned a steel yoke that could not be so easily disposed of. Hananiah's promised quick return for the exiles and the overthrow of Babylon was, in fact, a false hope. The ascendancy of Babylon over Judah would come to a smashing conclusion just a few years later when Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian emperor, tore down the city of Jerusalem, destroying the temple and taking even more Jews into exile. Well, one of the remarkable features of the book of Jeremiah and the career of the prophet Jeremiah is that in spite of his strident opposition to Hananiah's message of a quick reversal of fortunes for Judah, Jeremiah actually did hold out hope for Judah. Jeremiah did offer his compatriots hope, but it was a qualitatively different kind of hope. Jeremiah saw that relying upon Judah's own strength, or the strength of its presumptuous interpretation of God's promises to David, was in fact a false hope, a fraud. In fact, it was no hope at all. And in place of such a fraudulent hope, Jeremiah offered hope through trial and suffering. There was no shortcut to hope. There was no easy formula, no simple words could create hope. The hope of Israel could only be found through the trial of exile. And then, and only then, would an act of grace, an act of God's grace, in fact, be the basis for Israel's hope. Not a paycheck for any reformation of Judah's character, but a gift of divine grace. That was the foundation of the hope that Jeremiah would offer. As I've been reading the scriptures through the years and in recent weeks in preparation for tonight, I've been rather startled by what I've seen. Contrary to what we might want to believe, hope in the Bible, it most often is possible. We can arrive at hope most often only through a trial by fire, so to speak. It's a curiosity to me that in the Old Testament, one of the books that speaks most often about hope is, in fact, the book of Job. In fact, half of the occurrences of hope in the Old Testament are found in the book of Job, a book which surely, with the amount of suffering and the trials that Job went through, would surely induce despair. And yet we find the book brimming over with hope. Even in the Psalms, with their many laments over distresses and dangers that confront the psalmist, we find expressions of hope in the midst of the psalmist's suffering. Perhaps one of the most graphic descriptions of a situation that one would think is entirely devoid of hope is the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel 37. For there, an expanse of lifeless, desiccated bones stretches out before the prophet Ezekiel. And when the question is posed to Ezekiel, "Son of man, can these bones live?" the prophet replies, I think somewhat incredulously, "God only knows." But of course, in his almost mocking response, Ezekiel actually made the most important point. It is only God who knows and who's capable of bringing any hope to this valley of skeletal remains. In the New Testament, hope is often associated with the resurrection of Jesus. When we get to Paul's letters, for example, the fact of Jesus' resurrection provides the foundation for Christian hope. The resurrection is for Paul the down payment, or perhaps even the guarantee for the security and reality of our hope. If Jesus was not raised from the dead, Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 15, then we are of all people the ones who should be most pitied. Why? Because we've hoped in vain. The troubling fact about the resurrection and the hope that it brings is that in order to be raised from the dead, Jesus had to endure the crucifixion first. Without the crucifixion, there can't be any resurrection. Paul makes this connection between suffering and hope in Romans 5 when he asserts that we boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. Well, tonight, as I've thought about those texts and a number of passages, a few observations have come to me that I'd like to share with you. It's kind of random at some points, but here's some thoughts that I'd like to share with you tonight. First of all, there is no shortcut to hope. And to sharing hope, there is no shortcut. The journey that Judah was on was going to be painful and long. Jeremiah's words of hope didn't give the people a get out of jail free card. The path to hope had to go through their current circumstances. There was a price that had to be paid. There was no shortcut that would simply avoid the pain of exile and loss. In fact, as I've read the scriptures, I've come to the conclusion that hope comes only through the pain and suffering, not by denying it, and certainly not by avoiding it. What I'm suggesting is that in some ways, as a society, in our aversion to pain, our aversion to suffering or any kind of discomfort, we try to find a shortcut to hope. We want to believe prophets like Hananiah, who make pronouncements that promise hope without cost, cheap hope. But it seems to me such promises are fraudulent. Second, I'd suggest that hope is grounded in the faithfulness of God and God's love for the world. Now, Hananiah and those around him trusted in an ideology that convinced them that God would never allow Jerusalem to be captured by an enemy. Everything else they should have known about God was sacrificed in order to, well, maintain this one illusion. But it turned out to be a lie. The ruins of the temple would be evidence of its falsehood. And on the other hand, Jeremiah drew upon traditions of Israel that spoke on the one hand of God's faithfulness, a faithfulness that had clearly been seen in Israel's past, coupled with an accountability for its actions. The Old Testament speaks profoundly about God's love for Israel, deeply about God's love, a love that doesn't waver even in the midst of the Babylonian onslaught. That seems incongruous to me, but I'm stuck with it because I think that's what's actually there in the text. Job affirms God's goodness over and over again, even in the most troubling moments of his suffering. And in the New Testament, Paul speaks often about the resurrection of Jesus as the guarantee of our hope, but he speaks equally about the crucifixion. The two go together. That is, the resurrection confirms God's faithfulness to Jesus and to us, and is on the other hand a down payment on God's faithfulness to us in the future. Thirdly, this one I've hesitated about. We'll see how it goes. And you can write rude comments in the chat if you like about this. That's okay. Won't offend me. Bringing hope involves more than alleviating the immediate distress someone's in. It's more than anesthetizing someone against the immediate pangs of hunger, homelessness, or a marginalized existence. In a superficial way, I suppose that's what Hananiah was trying to do. He was reassuring the people of Judah that everything would be okay, things would get better, there really wouldn't be anything getting any worse. I once read a saying, one day I sat musing, sad and lonely, and a voice came to me out of the gloom saying, cheer up, things could be worse. And you know what? I cheered up and things did get worse. Well, that seems to me to say something about Hananiah's approach to the hope he was offering. But the story of Jeremiah, it seems to me, offers us some cautions as well as some encouragements as we think about the place of hope in our vision and bringing hope in our vision statement. The caution is that simple words of encouragement aren't enough. Neither can hope be produced simply out of soup kitchens and overnight shelters. Sadly, they're necessary. A Band-Aid on an open and festering social wound in our communities. Such provisions, such actions, as necessary as they are for human dignity and simple survival, I'd suggest fall short of bringing hope to those who suffer from social maladies of many kinds. Now, please understand, I'm not trying to denigrate or diminish in any way the value of many of the ministries that we undertake across this territory and around the world. They're important for the alleviation of human suffering. They're part of our Christian mandate and are part of our mission. Just read Matthew 25 to see Jesus' own estimation of the importance of feeding the hungry, watering the thirsty, welcoming the stranger, clothing the naked, tending to the sick, and visiting those imprisoned. This is valuable service, and it's mandated by Jesus himself. But I don't think it's entirely what the Bible means when it speaks of hope. Bringing hope, it seems to me, has to penetrate deeper and has to aim at transformation, at fundamental change, both in people and in circumstances, in lives and in society. I really find it very interesting that when William Booth underwent what Roger Green refers to as his second conversion experience in 1889 and 1890, what Roger means by that is that in 1889, 1890, as Booth thought about the mission of the Salvation Army, he began to think about it differently. Yes, prior to 1889 and 1890, the Salvation Army had been involved in various kinds of relief efforts, providing homes for the homeless, feeding the hungry, had been involved in all of that. But as Booth began to think about it, and I refer to this article an awful lot, it's a little article that was published in January 1889 in All the World, and it's entitled Salvation for Both Worlds. And in that little article, as Booth reflects upon 44 years of ministry, he says this at one point in the article. Now I seem to have pulled the bookmark out before I got to the right place. That was dumb. Let me see, I have it marked. Pardon me on this. Sorry about that, I've gone past it now. Into the next article. Okay. There we are. Find the marks. Oh, there it is. Okay. So Booth says, reflecting on 44 years of ministry, as I came to look more closely into things and gathered more experience of the ways of God to man, I discovered that the miseries from which I sought to save man in the next world were substantially the same as those from which I everywhere found him suffering in this world, and that they proceeded from the same cause. That's from our alienation from and rebellion against God and from his own disordered dispossessions. I saw that these made his outward hell, the hell of poverty, drunkenness, debauchery, crime, slavery, war, and every other form of outward misery. And I perceived also that these things produced the inward hell of ungoverned lust, passion, jealousy, envy, pride, etc. And that from them would spring all the deeper hells in the coming world. But with this discovery, there also came another one, which has been growing and growing in clearness and intensity from that hour to this, which was simply this: that I had two gospels of deliverance to preach, one for each world, or rather, one gospel that applies alike to both. I saw that when the Bible said, "He that believeth shall be saved," it meant not only saved from the miseries of the future world, but from the miseries of this world also. I keep coming back to that paragraph, couple of paragraphs in Booth's article, Salvation for Both Worlds, because what I think he's latched onto there is something that's fundamentally important, that when we talk about bringing hope, we need to recognize that we're not just talking about providing a service. In 1890, when Booth sort of organized administratively the work of the Army, he created what he called the social reform wing. Now pay attention to that, social reform wing, because that language speaks of transformation. That language speaks of hope. That reform, reformation, transformation is what the Army is about in our communities. So as we talk about bringing hope, I think it's important that we think in new ways that bring together transforming our communities, reforming our communities, and also reshaping and reforming, or in our language, saving the people who are part of it. Booth talked about almost a Freudian slip pre-Freud, salvation, two salvations, two gospels. And then he corrected himself. Oh, what I really mean is one gospel for both worlds. I found that really quite interesting, because what Booth suggested there is the tension that we've lived with since 1889, 1890, between what we sometimes describe as our social mission and our evangelistic mission, when in fact what Booth arrived at was the idea they're the same. There's one mission. And so bringing hope, it seems to me, involves this whole mission of the Army. And it involves us in the transformation and working toward the transformation of lives and society. So those are my thoughts this evening about what Scripture has to say about hope.
Dr. Don, thank you so much. What an amazing talk tonight about, not only where we were at, but where we can go. And three things you said that just really spoke deeply to me is that there is no easy road to hope. Because sometimes we think there's a shortcut. And that was the other thing you said, there are no shortcuts. And then you said, but hope is found in God's faithfulness. We don't have to look far. We don't have to dig a ditch or do something really special, but it's there for us to receive as we enter relationship with Christ. Thank you so much. We're about to enter into some breakout rooms, and that talk tonight will just give us so much to communicate about.
Yes,
Indira.
thank you, Liz. Absolutely. So now it's time for us to go to a breakout into our discussions into our group. So we say goodbye tonight to our friends who have logged in Facebook Live. And if you would like to join us next month on the Zoom discussion, please sign into salvationist.ca. If you have missed any of the conversation or would like to share with your friends, the video will be posted later onto our Facebook page and later on the Salvationist